Welcome to the first 2021 episode of Flying Sloppy. That's our little tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that regardless of how many thousands of hours you have in an airplane, you can always fly a little bit better. I'm David Miller with the CJP Safety Foundation, and with me today are Master Instructor Mr. Neil Singer, designated examiner in the 525 and the Phenom 100 and 300, and also an instructor in the Mustang and a all-around good guy, a writer for AOP Magazine. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
And, of course, the inimitable Mr. Charlie Precourt, four-time Space Shuttle crew member and twice as commander of the Space Shuttle, EAA Vice Chairman, NBAA board member, and all-around fairly decent guy in the simulator. Astronaut Charlie Precourt. Welcome, Charlie.
Thanks, David.
So, Neil, the last time we saw you, I think last month, you were about 6 to 8 inches deep in snow in the Northeast. How's the weather now?
Yeah, we've had a month of lots of snowfall here. I think I've got a picture you guys can put on screen.
Let's show that.
Last week up in Vermont, about 5 or 6 days of continuous snow up in northern Vermont. Great skiing weather. Had a good time up there. But there's been a lot of talk on the forums recently about, as pilots, the implication for snow. And particularly people have been talking about departures in snow. And there have been some requests that we talk about this at a convention. And I think we all agree that that would be a great topic. So we're going to try to work that into the schedule pretty soon. And as a teaser, I have a couple slides just to talk about real quickly why this is so important. So, David, you didn't know that you're getting a pop quiz right now. So, What's the relationship, David, between frost and V2?
Frost and V2.
Yeah, I'm just going to spare you.
This is a trick question.
Yeah, so let's talk about it real quickly.
Okay.
So a lot of us probably remember this tidbit from, maybe our instrument rating written exam, and we probably promptly forgot it, right? That a very thin layer, thickness of sandpaper on the leading edge of the wing can reduce lift by 30%, increase drag by 40%. So a lot of us just hear this and then we say, well, what does that mean? What does that, matter to me? Well, let's just do a quick little simple math here. So we said that little thin layer, the thickness of sandpaper on the leading edge or the top of the wing, will reduce lift by 30%. You may also remember from Aerodynamics 101 that stall speed varies as a function of the square root of how much lift we produce. So if we drop our maximum lift by 30%, what that effectively means to us is stall speed is going to go up by about 20%. So stall speed goes up by 20%. Well, V2 is allowed to be 1.2 times stall speed, and it's in the manufacturer's interest to minimize V2 because it's going to subsequently minimize the required takeoff distance. So you can pretty much guarantee that your V2 is going to be right around 1.2 times stall speed. So think about this. You didn't de-ice your airplane. You have a little bit of snow sticking to the top, ice, frost, whatever the case may be. You accelerate, you rotate, and you get to 35 feet above the ground at V2, which guess what? V2 is your new stall speed. And when can an airplane fly below its stall speed? When it's in ground effect. When does an airplane leave ground effect? Right around 30, 40 feet. So you're hitting the end of the runway. You've lifted the plane off the ground. Maybe you did or didn't notice the plane's not flying great, but now the plane is really hanging right on the edge of the stall. And there was a tragic accident happened to a business jet in the UK several years ago, exactly this scenario. So right after takeoff, the airplane began a rapid roll. And just think for a second how terrifying this must have been in the final moment of this crew's life. Full opposite aileron and rudder. They were unable to stop the roll, and the plane impacted the ground right after rotation, inverted. Everybody on board died. The aircraft wasn't de-iced, and the cause was determined to be frost on the wings. Not ice, not a foot of snow, just frost, just that thin layer of frost. And contributing to this, they recreated this situation, and they think maybe the APU exhaust was being blown back onto the wing by a tailwind when the APU was running. So it may have asymmetrically removed some of the ice from some of the wings. So that just goes to show how close to the margin our planes are for that first few seconds after liftoff. We don't tend to think about it because on two engines, we accelerate through that low speed regime so quickly, but we're really close to the margin for that first 50 feet of climb or so off the ground. And that literally could be the difference between life or death if we skip a proper de-icing, anti-icing regime. So just to cue you up a little bit, this is something we're hoping to talk about in the coming year.
Neil, that's excellent teaser. And I can attest to this personally. Early in my flying career, we'll talk a little bit more about this, David, when we get into some post-maintenance precautions here, but I used to be qualified in the Air Force to fly what was known as functional check flights. And we would never let an airplane come out right out of maintenance and go back into the operational squadron without going through this step where a certain small cadre of pilots qualified to fly a post-maintenance flight would take it out and ring it out. One of the things we did on another Cessna product, the T-37 jet that I used to do these tests in, was to actually reset the stall warning for the airplane. That particular airplane had little actuated strips that would come up off the engine nacelles. When the flaps were down, you didn't get natural buffet on the tail. So when you put the flaps down to give that buffet on the tail, as you got to the speed for stall warning, these little spoilers would come up on the engine nacelles and trigger a flow on the tail. Well, we actually had a mechanical device that we would carry with us on these flights to set that stall warning appropriately. We'd have our fuel weight, we'd know what the configuration was, we'd know what the speed would be, and we'd have that thing trigger at the actual stall plus 5 knots. Well, I was out doing one of these tests one day, and sure enough, I flew into a cloud getting set up, and I picked up some frost. And I looked back on the wing, and I thought, that's kind of interesting. I wasn't expecting that today. And no kidding, this was a layer of frost that was almost imperceptible. My stall speed was 15 knots higher. I was stunned. And so this is a truism that you just went through with everybody here, that it's not to be messed with. You get frost on the upper surface of the wing, you're going to have all kinds of trouble. So you've got to really watch for that. It's not just the ice, like you say.
That's a great point, Charlie. I think some concern that the three of us have talked about is reading some comments on the CJP website, for instance. There seems to be, in the wintertime, almost a race, a competition to see how fast you can get from your hangar to the end of the active runway. And when in some cases, it's not a race. You have to de-ice and you have to do some of the things and the procedures that you have to go through to really determine that are fairly involved. And so we're going to do a whole dedicated topic of that in the next safety video. But
well, you say, this is all about the little things, right? And
exactly.
It seemed like a little thing, but it's pretty huge.
So the topic of our video today is we call the little things. And it seems like as pilots, we do the big things pretty well. You know, we take off and we land, but sometimes the little things can be the biggest challenge that we have. And we had some comments recently from our viewers that led us to think about how important it is to double and triple check your airplane after it has just come in and come out of maintenance. I remember an example. I took delivery of my first Citation Mustang, serial number 8. And on the delivery flight, we taxied out to the end of the runway and we're about ready to take off. And there's a small issue. So we taxi back and they're preparing the airplane and everything's fixed and we taxi back. And as I'm just about to take the active runway, I run out of brakes. I realize I have no hydraulics. The maintenance guys had pulled a hydraulic circuit breaker so that it wouldn't whine while they were repairing it. And although I checked it the first time I taxied out, I didn't check it the second time I taxied out, although I had to use emergency brakes to get us stopped before the active runway. So little things like that are important. I know, and you know, that was on me. As pilots, we're responsible for all those checks, but it was something that I didn't do. And CJP is working on a post-maintenance checklist to kind of give our members and any pilot a list of things that they should pay a special attention to that you wouldn't normally pay attention to in operation of your airplane. And so we're working on that, and we'll have that soon. Neil, I know another area that you have had some concern about is pressurization. We recently had a member who had a pressurization incident related to maintenance. Airplane came out of maintenance, and that wasn't exactly, the airplane wasn't exactly how he thought it was set up. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure thing, David. So a member with a CJ3 Plus shared these photos with us. So I'll give everybody a second. Just look at the screen. And in one of these photos, everything's pretty much okay. And in one of these photos, there's a small difference that literally could kill you. And that, in fact, is really directly tied to the most common reason. I'll give you a hint that business aviation aircraft have experienced hypoxic pilots. So that's a pretty big hint. So of course, what we're talking about here is this air source knob, this bleed knob. So in the CJ3 Plus and the M2, this knob is on the left side of the panel. And you can see on the left-hand picture, the air source knob is as it should be for 99% of our flights, both engines providing bleed air. On the right side of the panel is how this particular owner found his aircraft after being released from maintenance. Okay, said ready to fly, signed off, go take your plane. One of the things the mechanics are supposed to do as part of their typically closing aircraft process is return all of these switches to their normal flight position. I've seen this omitted. I think David and Charlie have both seen this particular thing at one point or another, but many people have. What's insidious about this particular aircraft is that the both and the off are 180 degrees opposite from each other. So if you're just doing a real quick scan of your cockpit, up and down is what you normally see on this knob. You might miss the fact that up and down could mean both on or it could mean off. So this, again, was a CJ3 Plus for all of the 525s except for the CJ4. Again, both and off are 180 degrees opposite. I just randomly picked one of the legacy aircrafts. A 565 has the exact same situation. Fortunately, some of the newer aircraft, the 510, the CJ4, Cessna has moved to a different position here. So with off being not quite up and down, it's more likely to jog your eye and call your attention to this fact. So be particularly alert to this. If you fly a 525 pre-CJ4, if you fly a legacy aircraft, understand when you bring the plane out of maintenance, you may not have a real glaring knob position. It's shouting out to you something's wrong. Take a little time, really look at that carefully.
So there's a real difference then between looking at a switch and seeing the switch. I think we may get accustomed to things being exactly the way we normally see them, and we glance as part of our checklist, and we've already assumed that the switch is in the right position because we expect it to be, and it was before. So we need to take a little more time and think about that switch position. Charlie, I got to stop here because I saw the coolest video of Charlie. Those of you who know Charlie or may know him a little bit better through these videos know that he runs a rocket company. It is rocket science for Charlie, and his company makes the largest rocket engines ever made by man. Or we're about to get to that point by going to the moon, Mars, and beyond. And we got some cool video of a rocket test. Can you talk about it? What you just witnessed in the last couple of weeks?
Sure. Actually, a couple of tests, and I can share my screen here. But we are, in fact, building a launch vehicle that will actually exceed the capability of the Apollo Saturn V for NASA's program to return to the moon. And we've had a few tests of that. The first flight of it will be probably in the October-November timeframe of this year. It's going to be a big event. The thing is immense. 9 million pounds of thrust coming off the launch pad. So let me show you. Matter of fact, these are for sale. We do sell rocket motors commercially. So we can get you and your citation to 410 or 450 in about 2 minutes.
Awesome. If awesome.
Just call me up and I'll get you set up. But, here's one of those. I'll show you now.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
I'm kind of known for asking stupid questions, so this is one I've given some thought to. How do you bolt the rocket, the engine down? How do you keep it from going someplace?
So we have them anchored into incredible amount of concrete that's buried down into the subsoil. And the biggest motor we produce is for this Moon-Mars rocket, produces somewhere around 3.7 million pounds of thrust. And we lay it over horizontally. As a matter of fact, there's a picture of it here in my office behind me, going through the rocket firing. And it's laid horizontally, and the front end of it is thrusting into this immense concrete block structure, reinforced concrete that is embedded into the granite structure below the surface. And so it carries the whole thrust through that anchoring, if you will. There's also a thrust measuring device on the front end of that too.
Wow, where else can you get this kind of information but CJP safety videos, you know? So back to our topic, Charlie. Did anyone ever leave the pressurization switch off in the shuttle?
You know, we worried about that all the time, and the answer is no. That, to my knowledge, we never had that on liftoff, but we did have a depressurization on board the Mir space station when there was a collision with an oncoming cargo vehicle, and those guys almost had to bail out. They went through a depressurization thing. But I did have on my first flight a different kind of maintenance issue. It just goes to show that as good as maintenance people are, and we love our folks that we take our jets to, they are doing a different job than flying the airplane. And the handoff, that interface between the maintainer and the flyer, is a delicate one. And that's why I mentioned earlier this functional check flight concept that the military came up with. It was to preclude having operational flyers who are going out and doing, you know, simulated air combat training and so forth, from having to run into these maintenance issues on a first flight after the airplane comes out of maintenance. One that I had happen on a space shuttle was, you'll love this. I know you always ask me, David, what it's like to go to the bathroom in space. So this is funny today. It wasn't so funny on orbit, but the toilet in the space shuttle goes into a wastewater tank, and all of you that have the blue water to contend with know what I'm talking about. Except on the space shuttle, the tank is quite large and it can handle wastewater for crew of 7 for 10 days. And intermittently, we would actually purge it and empty the fluids into space, and create a little snowstorm, and it would sublimate in the vacuum of space. Well, in order for that to work, this tank had a bellows on one end and nitrogen pressure behind the bellows. And as it filled up, it would compress the bellows back against the nitrogen pressure, and that pressure would tell us when it was full and time to void it, and we'd go, you know, jettison the fluid into space. Well, the bellows got put in wrong in maintenance before the flight. So when we got on orbit, we couldn't operate the toilet, and I became a plumber on my first flight. And it was nasty, and I had to go down there and reconnect lines, and with my commander and fellow pilot, the three of us were, you know, plumbers for the first couple of days, figuring out how to move from that wastewater tank to contingency wastewater bags that allowed us to stay on orbit, or we would have had to come home.
So, Charlie, you actually were certified to put up with a lot of crap on the shuttle. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly right. Well,
okay.
Yeah, this was number one, but yeah.
So in a little more serious vein, I know Neil talking about pressurization system, and I'll give you another example. I think you have a story. I came out of maintenance in my Mustang, and took off and gear up, and I get no pressurization, and turn around, back land. We put it back in maintenance. They work on it for a few hours, take off again, gear up, no pressurization, land again, and finally we have a picture of this. Oh, by the way, thank you to Lad Sanger for providing a picture from his Mustang. But during the maintenance procedure, they had removed the emergency escape hatch from my airplane. And when they reinserted it, it was a 64th of an inch off from being seated in the fuselage. So there was all the pressure forcing the air out that tiny hole, and the cabin would not pressurize. That was an inconvenience for me. But Neil, I think you have a story about something that was a little more serious.
Yeah, David. So this is actually a post-maintenance story, just like we've been talking about. But in this particular case, it wasn't a maintenance error. It was a real small system subtlety that I had certainly never considered before, with thousands of hours of light jet time and citation time. And so it's an interesting story, and it's an interesting example of how post-maintenance flights create an opportunity for things to go wrong in sometimes completely unforeseen ways. So the story starts with a departure in CJ3, just like we see on the screen here, and climbing out of just 1,000 or 2,000 feet, we get the ding and the master caution light comes on. So we look up at the annunciator panel and we see a cabin door annunciator. Okay, so immediately this implies the cabin door may not be closed, potentially catastrophic, potentially very serious. So pull out the checklist, we run the checklist, and the checklist starts with basically depressurizing the airplane, because the idea is it's a differential pressure that might try to push that door open. So if the door is not fully closed, not seated correctly, then having the plane depressurized decreases the chances that that door is going to fly open and potentially cause some serious collateral damage. So we did this procedure. We moved our pressurization switch to the manual position. We held that lever up. We were at low altitude, so depressurizing wasn't any physiological concern. We slowed down, and it was just us on board. We returned and landed, and unfortunately canceled our winter flight down to Key West. So we were quite unhappy about that. So we left the plane with maintenance, and as often is the case with Mustangs and 525s, when we get a cabin door message, it's usually a bad proximity switch or micro switch. And that's what was the case in here. The door was actually closed. The micro switch was just out of alignment. And so the micro switch was saying that the door was not fully latched, when in fact it was. So 24 hours later, the problem's resolved. Micro switch either replaced or readjusted. And 24 hours later, we're set to climb out and go down to Key West again. This time, climbing through 10,000 feet, we don't get a yellow caution, we get a master warning. Okay, so we get the ding, ding, ding. This is climbing through, I want to say, about 14,000 feet. This is a decade ago or so. So we're climbing through about, let's say, 14,000 feet, and we look over and we get the cabin altitude. So now this is obviously pretty serious, right? And so a quick quiz for everybody to think about in the comfort of your home is, anytime you get a cabin altitude, if you're over 10,000 feet, the first step should be to put your mask on. Okay. You shouldn't think about it. You shouldn't be thinking, am I that high? Am I not that high? I really dislike when I hear stories about people trying to start troubleshooting without their mask on. So the very first thing we did was put our mask on. But here we are climbing through 15,000 feet with a cabin altitude light. What's the next thing we should do as soon as we have our mask on? I'll give you a hint. It's right here. Well, the next thing we should do is reach up and hit that altitude button and stop the plane from climbing. All right, the plane's not pressurizing. We absolutely don't want to continue climbing. So as soon as the mask is on and the immediate memory items are dealt with, emergency descent's clearly not necessary when we're only at 15,000 feet, but continuing the climb is definitely not in our interest. So, I encourage people to think about that there's often this hesitation to not comply with your ATC clearance. So if ATC just issued you a clearance to climb and maintain flight level 280 and you're climbing through 15,000 feet, there's a reluctance sometimes in pilots to disregard that climb to 280. And remember, we harp on this a lot. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Communicate's at the end of the list for a reason. Before you worry about talking to ATC, telling them you're leveling off, certainly not asking them permission to level off when you have a failure to pressurize, certainly get the plane in a safe state. So oxygen mask on, stop the climb. Then you can start dealing with what's happening. And then when that's done, you can talk to ATC. Okay, nobody's going to fly into you in the 45 seconds it takes you to level the plane off and start running a checklist. All right, the airspace is not that tight. What happened here requires a little digging into exactly what these two switches do in the 525s. And it's something that we probably hear every year and recurrent, but maybe we never thought about the interface between these two switches, the relationship between these two switches. So when we look at the pressurization system, specifically the outflow valves on the 525, that manual auto switch, all it does is think of it as an on-off switch. It's just turning on or off the pressurization computer's ability to control the outflow valves. That's all it does. So when you're in auto, the pressurization system can use the climb and dive solenoids, electrically powered, and then use bleed air to inflate or deflate the outflow valves. When you go to manual, you're just removing that electrical power. But the key thing is when you're in auto, what I don't think I'd ever been told in recurrent is when you're in auto, that manual switch is still 100% effective and has authority over the pressurization system. So what had happened was the day before, we depressurized the airplane by bringing that manual switch to the up position. Land the airplane, goes into maintenance, comes out, we pre-flight the airplane, we take off. The plane is in auto pressurization. Unbeknownst to us until we started troubleshooting, this manual up-down switch is spring-loaded to the center position. This switch hadn't been used in the 5, 6, 7 years of the airplane's life to this point. Maybe somebody had spilled a Coke in it as a used airplane. Maybe in its prior life, something had gotten that switch sticky. So the switch was ever so slightly not in the centered position. Visually, it looked like it was in the center position, but it was ever so slightly still in the up position. So what was happening to us is we're climbing, the pressurization switch was in auto. However, this manual toggle valve was open enough that when we go to the up position, what it's doing is it's allowing any air inside those outflow valves to exit into the nose wheel. There's vacuum in the nose wheel effectively. So as a result, the outflow valves collapse, all the bleed air goes overboard, none of it stays in the pressure vessel. So we're climbing out through 14,000 feet and the computer is telling the plane it desperately needs to pressurize. So it's sending this 23 PSI air into the outflow valves to inflate them and block outflow of air. And just as quickly as the computer is trying to send air into the outflow valves, this switch that was cracked open is allowing that air to vent overboard through that nose wheel compartment. And as a result, the outflow valves were not in fact inflating. So again, there was no maintenance error. There was no pilot error. Again, we visually ascertained that the switch was in the center position, and it was really probably just a millimeter cracked out of center. As soon as we started the troubleshooting, we moved the switch a little bit and realized that it wanted to go back a little bit more to the center. So again, on this theme, post-maintenance flights create Murphy's Law in so many different ways, some of which probably no one's ever foreseen could happen.
So things may not be exactly as they appear to be.
Exactly.
Charlie, last month we talked about the danger involved in copying a clearance while you begin a taxi out of a ramp. But if you could compound that, what if you didn't even have brakes? I think you have a story was it your One Plus?
It was. I was coming out of maintenance, and they had done some work on the brakes and the tires. I can't remember exactly what it was, but obviously they were working in that area. And I go through the normal startup, and everything looked pretty good. Although some of the things that you'll see in our checklist that we're going to provide our members, things like position of the microphone switches, and the mic switch for mask was in mask instead of mic, and things of that nature, that you got to check all these things. And some of those were out of position, and got everything going, taxiing out to the runway, and the brakes felt spongy. And I'm thinking, this is not right. And so I didn't abort on the runway. I actually aborted on the taxiway. I'm contemplating, is this just slightly different because they've done some work on it and this is the new normal for these brakes or not? And then I convinced myself, no, this is just not right. Took it back to the hangar, and it took them quite a while to figure it out. I actually had to jump back in the cockpit, and I helped them a little bit. It turned out the co-pilot seats brakes were more guilty, and they had air in the lines that was causing a problem. And it wasn't until I jumped in the co-pilot seat and stepped on the brakes we found those were worse, and they were able to draw more of that air out. So again, things aren't like they always appear, just like you say. And I know we're going to get into this some more about things that can go wrong when you make the judgment to continue or not. we want to err on the side of very conservative when it comes to airplanes coming out of maintenance. And, you end up in a situation where you don't, and something goes wrong and you have to declare an emergency. Somebody may come asking you what happened, and this maintenance release form is pretty important. If you should have an issue with your airplane and you've decided to press on, you need to know that anything that was wrong with the airplane was in fact looked at by maintenance. So I said it earlier, I'll say it again. We did it in the military. Functional check flights was intentionally inserted with a special cadre of pilots to break that interface between the maintainers and the operators, to make sure that there was a tight closed loop, that airplane was indeed ready to go back to operational use.
Yeah, Charlie, I have a exact story about the maintenance release and that kind of, about a month ago, I'm departing out of Dallas Love on 13 left in my C90 King Air, which had just come out of maintenance and had got new brakes and tire and wheels and that kind of stuff. And after maintenance, we taxied around the ramp and everything was fine. And here I am on the cleared for takeoff. And at about 30 knots, here's what I see. I think we have a picture. And it's a low hydraulic quantity amber light on the annunciator panel. So I abort the takeoff and I pull off and I tell the tower I'm aborting, of course, and they say, we need a reason for the abort for the form, for the paperwork. So I thought, okay, and I gave them the reason. I taxied back to the maintenance place. They checked the hydraulic fluid. It had not been serviced, even though we checked it. It was low. The quantity was low. They filled it up and the guy said, okay, you're good to go. And I said, no, I'm not good to go. I need a maintenance release because just for the form. And that's exactly what you're talking about. I think we have a close-up of that kind of release that you get. But it's important when you have an issue that involves ATC that you have a paper trail, because the FAA may be interested in exactly what you did or didn't do that caused that issue.
That's right. And you'll see in the form gets signed by the guy that signed off the work. And it could be important to you that you can demonstrate that you had the airplane looked at. And you should get a release not only for when you come out of normal maintenance, but if you've got a squawk like you had with the hydraulics, you take that back in there. You don't want to do your own self-directed ferry flight and not have one of these in your pocket, because it could get. And I've become more of a fan of static takeoffs for this reason. If you get cleared on the runway for takeoff and you run up the engines and all of a sudden something shows up that you don't like, yellow light still there or whatever, you can just tell tower, hey tower, I'm going to clear back off onto the apron here for a minute. We're looking at a problem. And you don't have an issue with an abort that they're going to need to fill out the form. But if you decide to do a rolling and all of a sudden you got to abort and clear it at a taxiway halfway down the runway, you're filling out the form. And if it was something that's a self-directed ferry flight, they're going to really take a look. So just be safe, especially when the airplane's coming out of maintenance. And don't be doing self-directed ferry flights, whatever it is, flaps, gear down. Make sure you get one of these release forms first and that ferry flight is endorsed before you go somewhere.
Just in the few minutes that we have left, guys, I want to get your opinion on something, and that is the induced pressure or stress to fly your airplane right out of maintenance. In my case, with dual pressurization issues, I had to land twice. Now it's getting dark. There's weather en route, and there's, when do we say no? How do we talk ourselves into saying, this day's been long enough and I need to depart tomorrow? Or do you have rules about departing with an airplane just out of maintenance?
Our SOPs specifically say after major maintenance, the pilot we recommend doesn't make a flight in IMC or at night. So that's going to give you the deck stacked in your favor, right? If you should happen to have one of these problems we've talked about, brake issue, failure to pressurize, you have a lot more bandwidth free in day VMC than you do at night or IMC.
Very true. And the same thing, I'll just go back to the way we did it in the military with these functional check flights. It would take us hours to get through signing off an airplane that came out of major maintenance, whether they're changing engines or doing a major dock inspection, tearing the airplane apart. Our pre-flight was with all panels off, and we would look in and look for things to be connected. one of my buddies had to eject out of a T-38 because both hydraulic system reservoir caps were left off the reservoirs. And he got to altitude and all hydraulics had bled out, and you can't land that airplane without hydraulics. So he had to eject. So it's serious stuff. And a lot of the stuff that's behind those panels, you know, we're not professing that you do that on it and make yourself a military functional check flight pilot, but treat the thing with respect and don't stack the deck against you with night and IMC, and just plan on it taking you some time. And, you know, if you can't get there early in the morning and go over the airplane in detail with the maintenance guys, just wait until the next day. Take some time.
You know, David, we talked about a year ago when we're returning to flying, being somewhat rusty, not making your first flight a must-do flight. And I think you really apply the same logic to the first flight after maintenance. Don't make it a must-do flight. You know, don't show up at the shop and you've got a meeting 2 time zones away in 3 hours you have to be at. You know, you want to create a situation where should something come up, there's no time pressure, there's no mission pressure.
Hey guys, as usual, we could talk all day about all kind of cool stuff. This has been fantastic. I hope our members have enjoyed this. And this kind of information is available on our website. You're seeing it now, but tell any pilot you know, there's no charge for this. You can just literally go to the CJP website and click on the safety, and all our safety content is available 24/7 free of charge to any pilot. If you have ideas, email safety@CJP, and we'll talk about them. And we enjoy doing that. Thanks, guys, and look forward to seeing you on the next edition. Fly safe. And hey, folks, if you find these broadcasts entertaining or educational, like them and subscribe to them on our channel. I think you can press the bell icon and to see more of them. So we'd love to have you as regular members.
The CJP Safety and Education Foundation is committed to providing all pilots with the best tools to safely operate their airplane. Our content is always free of charge, and you can access it by clicking on the Safety tab on our website. Until next time, fly safe.